It's time for another podcast by George. Straight talk, straight from the heartland, that'll have you saying, "By George, I think he's got it." Now, here's George.
It's called Howl at the Moon.
Hello, hi, how are you? And welcome on back into another podcast by George. Well, we've got another journalism hero of mine on the podcast. It's Nathan J. Robinson. This guy is the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. I've been following him on Twitter and reading the magazine online. You know, I used to get a lot of my information from Rolling Stone magazine, but Current Affairs is kind of becoming my go-to publication of late. Yeah, and I saw a piece of his in The Guardian. Nathan is also the... well, you're like the U.S. editor for The Guardian, is that correct?
No, I'm just a columnist, just a mere political columnist.
Oh, just a mere Let me read this guy's bio. I love reading these things. Nathan Robinson, he's an American writer, author, former law clerk, columnist for The Guardian, as he mentioned, current editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. He founded that magazine in 2015. He has a Ph.D. from Harvard University, a Bachelor and Master of Arts degree from Brandeis University, a law degree from the Yale Law School, and he's the author of a new book, Why You Should Be a Socialist. And Nathan, I got to tell you, my wife is always the first one to bring this up. Socialist has such a negative connotation in America. She says anytime you say that, you should immediately point out that socialism is rampant in this country when it comes to corporate America. So it's not like it's something that we don't have experience with and we don't know what it's all about, because the corporations have been the benefactors of socialism in America for decades.
Yeah, and the other thing that I tend to point out is that we have plenty of socialist institutions in the United States, right? People worry about socialized medicine, but they have a socialized fire department, and it doesn't bother them at all, right? We don't have private we don't anymore, and we're thankful for the fact that we don't have private companies putting out people's fires. We have the government do it, and that's what people are advocating for. Socialists are advocating for in terms of the healthcare system, and it's considered crazy, but you benefit from the protections of a socialized system every day.
Yeah, we were talking off camera a little bit before we started this. I sent out the invite to Nathan a few days ago. It took a little while for him to get to us, and I'm glad that he did. And my God, what's happened since then? This Iranian situation, Nathan. I'm looking at this Qasem Soleimani guy over there, and I'm listening to the mainstream media reports that are demonizing the man. But he strikes me as being a very popular Iranian war hero or war general over there, and in some ways he could be looked at as being, I don't know if not a friend, but a benefactor of the United States, because this guy defeated ISIS. Is that right?
Well, yes. I mean, that's the important point, right? I mean, that's why are the Iranians so upset? Why are there millions of people in the streets, mourning him? And the reason is because they associate him with the defeat of the Islamic State, which presumably we would think was something that we endorsed. It's a little strange that, you wouldn't at least recognize him for that achievement. And Americans, I mean, there's just one line that is repeated about him, which is that he was, quote, responsible for the deaths of Americans. And that is, first off, there's never any evidence cited for that. You can notice every time people say that, they don't cite any actual evidence because it's a Pentagon claim. And the claim is based on, an estimate of how many IEDs that were manufactured in Iran. As best as I could tell, IEDs that were manufactured in Iran killed American soldiers. And so it's not actually directly linked to Soleimani. But even if that was the case, I mean, you have to consider everything in the wider context of our actual presence in Iraq, right? I mean, responsible for the deaths of Americans sounds very bad, but also we need to remember we had invaded and occupied a country. When we're talking about militias that are resisting U.S. occupation, they're resisting U.S. occupation. And you can understand why to people in that region, this guy who resisted U.S. power in the region might be considered something of a hero.
And I want to put this map up. I've had it on the podcast before, and I know you've seen a similar map many times. But it's Iran and how it's surrounded by United States military installations. And, of course, it's also bordering a country that we overthrew, Iraq, that we're all over. And this Salami, he's demonized because he was making plans for potential war with the United States. But if you look at that map, my God, why wouldn't he? And isn't that what generals do? I mean, was he making plans to go to war with us or to combat the United States? And if you look at him being surrounded by us, why wouldn't he?
Well, they're not only not only neighboring a country that we overthrew the government of, they are a country that we overthrew the government of. And,
true.
Within the lifetimes of still living people in 1953, right? Their first democratic government, we were responsible for getting rid of that government and installing a hated dictator. So, I mean, like, there is good reason why the Iranians fear and despise us. And one reason is, we don't want them to have nuclear weapons, but we're perfectly content to point nuclear weapons ourselves at the whole world. We're perfectly content to have Israel point nuclear weapons at Iran, but if Iran wants to defend itself by saying, well, there's nothing that you should have that we shouldn't have, then we consider that a hostile act, even though by any objective standard, we're the ones who've instigated that hostility and aggression.
And, of course, we tore up the nuclear treaty, which everybody knows, and now we've assassinated this guy. And I saw a poll. I don't know how they survey Iranians, but he was like 68% of the population. This guy was extremely popular. He was beloved.
Yeah.
You can't find anybody in modern American history like that in this country, going back to one of my heroes, John Kennedy. I don't know if he was that popular when Oswald shot him from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. I mean, this dude was really popular over there, and they're going to respond in some way or another. And of course, there's no nuclear treaty now. So is Iran going to go back to building a nuclear bomb?
There was just an Iranian cleric who was quoted and asked, well, who would the Iran assassinate in revenge? What wouldn't you take? So is Iran going to target one of America's similar heroes? And the cleric said, America doesn't have similar heroes. Who are we going to assassinate? SpongeBob? Spider-Man? All of America's heroes are fictitious.
Yes.
They're comic book characters. They said America doesn't have anyone who's the equivalent of Soleimani, who was, just a seriously respected kind of apolitical, considered a political guy. It seems like an act that is designed to humiliate Iran and to point out that America is so powerful that it could destroy them at any moment. But it's very risky because you humiliate a country like that and you antagonize them. Even if the state doesn't respond with a violent act, some individual could commit a violent act of terrorism in response. And because we associate all Iranians with the Iranian government, the United States would then see that act as an excuse to go to war, and they would blame the entire country of Iran for the actions of a single individual, which is what they do. So that's the real scary risk here.
Well said. And the point that I make to folks all the time, and it's almost Sicilian or, Godfatherish or whatever, they may come after us, but they may not do it immediately. Obviously, they haven't done it immediately. They've been in mourning over there for a few days, but it may take weeks, months, years, generations. They may come after our grandchildren. They may come after our great-grandchildren, and we'll be sitting here wondering, why? What would they do that for? Well, folks, they're coming. Well, anyway, I want to leave that there. Before I lose you today, I wanted to go to this most recent article. I want to read this, and I wanted you to talk a little bit about this because it's really important right now. It's entitled "How to Avoid Swallowing War Propaganda." The Trump administration has assassinated Iran's top military leaders we've been discussing. And you say it's a good time to think about propaganda and how it works and train ourselves to avoid accidentally swallowing it. Number one on the list, and it couldn't be more important, and it seems like it's, goes without saying, but it needs saying, and that is, things are not true because a government official says them. And if you watch mainstream media, you're hearing reporters that have basically become repeaters. That's what we call them. They're just mouthing the government line.
Well, what happens here? Yeah, and it's funny because every time you say to someone, well, things aren't true because the government official said, everyone goes, oh, yes, of course. I mean, everyone believes that. But if you look at how this works in practice, we know that if you go back to the Iraq War, so we don't repeat the mistakes of that war, right? What used to happen was the New York Times would print, United States says Saddam Hussein intensifies his quest for parts to build a nuclear weapon. And the New York Times would technically print that it was just a government claim. So technically they're not saying it's true because the government said it. But if you read the headline, you will sort of absorb the idea that it's probably true. And, so they have sort of plausible deniability that the New York Times is is actually endorsing the claim, right? Because they're just saying that this is the allegation that is being made. But when that is repeated, what happens is the phrase U.S. says disappears. And I just saw this on Vox, right? And Vox is pretty good, actually, these days. I mean, they've gotten a lot better. They're pretty good. And this was an article that was very critical of Trump on Iran, but it said Iran has killed around 600 Americans. Soleimani in Iran has killed around 600 Americans. And I clicked the link for the source, and it went to a Military Times article that said, the Pentagon says Iran has killed 600 Americans. Well, the Pentagon says disappeared as that factoid migrated to Vox, and then it's just treated as an absolute. It's unquestionable, but the actual evidence you never see.
I would like to go through every point on this list, but I'm going to skip around here a little bit. One of these things, and we've done this a little bit already, but imagine how everything would sound if the other side said it. Now, you can do this in politics, but you can do this in this Iranian situation, too. Yeah. Suppose you were Iran. Put yourself in their place. I mean, that's critical. That's critical thinking, really.
Yes. Oh, it's so important because it enables you to see why a lot of the language that is used is propaganda speak, right? So there are a lot of people claiming that this wasn't an assassination, for example. And they claim that because they say, well, it was legitimate. If it's not legitimate, if it's legitimate or legal, then it wasn't an assassination. But, when you think about, okay, well, what if Iran did this to us? Is there any world in which we would consider this same act committed against someone in this country to not be an assassination? And the answer is no. That'd be crazy, right? I mean, it would so obviously be an assassination. The same is true, obviously, when we think about like terms like terrorism. That word only applies to things that are done to us, not things that our country does to other people. And so it's really important when you think about like, well, what would happen if Iraq had invaded us instead of us invading them? And would we still think that that violent resistance to that occupation was terrorism? And the answer is no, we wouldn't. We'd think of it as, probably heroic, actually. And so that helps you understand why people in other countries see us as the aggressors and themselves as the people who are in the right. And it's so critical to try and take an objective or the other side's view in order to understand what's what, because everyone looks good from their own vantage point, right? Even like Hitler thought he was good.
Sure he did.
Right? I mean, he didn't think he was an evil man. He thought he was a man who was doing the quote right thing. So the question for a morally serious person is to go, am I the bad person in this situation? Because everyone thinks they're the good person. But are you? You have to really ask. And in order to ask, you have to think about how it looks to someone who isn't you.
Next up on your list is watch out for euphemisms, and that bears some explanation. I don't know if this was exactly a euphemism, but they when talking about Soleimani, they talk about taking him out. They don't talk about this being a murder, certainly, and they don't talk about it being an assassination, which is really what it was. And they also refer to this guy as a terrorist. Well, when we think of a terrorist, we think of a guy with, a bomb walking into a marketplace or something and blowing everybody up. This guy was a military man, and I mean, he's in the business of war, basically. And he probably killed some people, but is that what you mean by?
Is every general a terrorist? I mean, he's accused mainly of killing even the accusations against him where he killed American soldiers. I mean, when we talk about terrorism, usually we're supposed to be referring to
civilians,
attacks on civilians that are designed to terrorize a civilian population. But the accusation against him is mainly about American soldiers. So, he doesn't even fit the U.S. definition of terrorist. But a terrorist is really just anyone who is an enemy of our country. And yeah, he should be properly classified as a high government official, because that's what he is. I mean, again, we have to think about people in Iran the same way we would think about people in our own country, the same way we would think about, people in European countries. I mean, is Vladimir Putin a terrorist? I mean, Bernie Sanders recently pointed out that, if we start applying the standard that the U.S. has now adopted regarding Soleimani, you could kill almost any head of state because they're all responsible for killings. But having international law and having a system that is not just anarchy depends on us not just believing that we can unilaterally execute anyone who has done a horrible thing.
And last on your list here, and probably my favorite, is listen to the Chomsky on your shoulder. I got to have you talk about that because he's beloved by progressives. Obviously, I just saw an interview with him down in Arizona, I think. But what about Noam Chomsky, and what is it you want people to remember or listen to that Chomsky on their shoulder?
Well, I'm a big fan of Chomsky's work, and he's been very nice personally to our magazine, and has endorsed some of our work. But I mean, I really grew up with his writings, and they helped me think more clearly about politics. And one of the ways in which they do that is all the stuff I say in that article. These points are points that I first understood only because I read his work. And, he's the one who taught me. He's constantly saying, well, look at it from their perspective. Look at the historical context. Look at what words mean. Look at how they're being used. Don't assume that the U.S. is right because it's the U.S. And so he's been very clarifying for me in helping me see through he wrote the book, The Manufacturing Consent, the way in which public opinion is molded and people come to believe something without realizing that they believe it because they've been told it, and they've been told it for a particular purpose. And he really shows exactly how that process works. And if you're kind of aware of how it works, you can resist it.
Well, that's great, and I love to close on Chomsky, and I'd love to talk to you all night, but we don't have the time for that. And you're a smart guy. You're multi-talented. You've got, my God, multitasking. You've got all of these things going on. What's next now? What's top of mind with you? What do you got in the works that's coming up as far as people? It's kind of like a minute by minute thing on Twitter, but what's on your mind right now?
Well, so I've got another book that I'm working on right now, which is quick responses to 100 terrible conservative arguments. That will be out for about a year. The thing that I'm kind of focused on right now mostly is going to be the primary, because the big thing at the moment is the Democratic primary. I think that it's very important that Bernie Sanders win that primary, and so a lot of my writing is going to be turned into things that I think are going to be useful to advancing that goal. So it's not going to be as thoughtful and deep for the next. It might be sort of a lot of pro-Bernie stuff coming in the next few weeks or month. But that's what I think that's what's on my mind right now, because it's kind of the most important thing going on politically, as because you're in Iowa.
Yeah, we've got these Iowa caucuses coming up. How much weight do you put in the historical context, which I've been talking to people a lot on this podcast and elsewhere, which is since 1976, the nominee for both parties has won either the Iowa caucus or the New Hampshire primary, with the exception of 1992 when we had a favorite son in the race, Tom Harkin, which kind of threw 1992 out. But other than that, you win one of those two states, you're going to win your party's nomination. Do you think that'll hold, or do you think we're going to break with tradition?
No, I think that there's a reason that holds, which is that, by the time these caucuses unfold, the position, the campaign's been going for a long time, right? And the differences between the people have sort of gotten to know the candidates, so it is a pretty strong indicator of where things are going to at, and things have kind of fixed by that point in a way that they haven't months previous. But then also, people discuss momentum and the way that winning those primaries then creates the impression that you're a winner, which then compounds. More people think, oh, well, this person is a winner, and the subsequent states are then impacted by what happens in those first two states. So, I mean, it's hard to say, right? I mean, in politics, unexpected things happen all the time. Traditions that have held for decades are broken all of a sudden, right? Donald Trump is the president, so anything. You never know what's going to happen, right? Conventional wisdom can break down, but at the same time, I do think that, I mean, my bet would be that whoever the ultimate nominee is going to win either Iowa or Hampshire or both.
Do you have any concern, and I know that I do, that if Bernie were to be, I don't know, if he were to come out of these Iowa, now he's going to win New Hampshire probably. He's from nearby Vermont. He probably will win New Hampshire. If he were to win Iowa and New Hampshire, would the centrist DNC get behind Bernie? Is that going to happen? Can you see that?
Well, I mean, this is the real question, right? What's going to happen if Bernie starts to win? And I think it's very uncertain. I mean, there was a quote from a source close to Barack Obama recently that said Barack Obama would intervene in the election to stop Bernie Sanders getting the nomination. Now, I don't know if he actually would do that, but it is true that there are a lot of people who are sort of anybody but Bernie people in the Democratic Party who would do anything possible to stop him winning. But at the same time, right, a lot of people in politics are opportunistic. And they're opportunistic meaning that if it looks like Bernie is going to win, they might jump on the Bernie train because ultimately it's good for them to back a winner, right? Nobody wants to have opposed Bernie if then he becomes the president and then you need a favor, right? So they're all going to be making a calculation, and that calculation is my desire to stop Bernie outweighed by my fear of what happens if I put everything into stopping Bernie and then I fail?
Yeah. Well, and again, we leave it there. I do you think maybe I could check in with you once more before the caucuses?
Oh yeah, let's do it. Yeah,
right.
Absolutely.
Because I want to talk these political candidates, and I've got my own list.
Yeah, we have to talk about Biden.
Yeah, Biden. Well, I said when I launched the podcast, basically, I said there are three candidates that cannot win in the Democratic Party. Joe Biden was top of the list. Pete Buttigieg was next, and I don't think Elizabeth Warren can win either. And I think the Democratic Party is riding a divine wind. I think they're the kamikaze of politics right now, and if they nominate either one of those three candidates, I think you're looking at Trump 2020. But
I'm totally with you on that. So let's, I'll come back and we can talk about talk more about this.
Ah, that's great. That's Nathan J. Robinson, folks. He's the editor-in-chief of Current Affairs magazine. He's the Guardian's U.S. columnist, and he's got that great new book out I would encourage you to check out, Why You Should Be a Socialist. And then the title of is that a working title, or is that the title of the new book within a year or so, Nathan?
Oh, well, yeah, we haven't quite... I'm thinking of calling it Destroyed, Quick Responses to 100 Conservative Arguments, but we haven't quite decided yet.
Okay. Well, we'll chat again soon. The Iowa caucuses are a little less than a month away, so
my gosh.
All the best, pal. All right,
Thanks,
that'll do it. We're going to take it from there. That's going to do it. That's another podcast by George.